too late, I can't get out of this. And it is really nice. I've spoken about 6 times at this conference. They like to think it's completely new because it was called UCAAD, but somehow it's newer and better and all of that. And I don't think I've spoken to so many. I'm quite into sort of fringe topics, and I tend to. The first time I spoke at one of these conferences was on adoption and addiction, because adoptees are really overrepresented in addiction programs. They put me on at 8 o'clock in the morning on a Saturday. Although actually, quite a few people turned up and said, by the way, I'm adopted. I think a couple of years ago, I can't remember, I did the financial addictions. You'd think everybody would be there. There was just a few of us. It's hard, and I guess money's one of the things it's hardest to talk about. But we're going to talk about boarding school syndrome, addiction and recovery. And I've had an interesting time preparing this talk. Firstly, it's the first time I've done a talk where somebody's actually asked me if I have a connection to the topic. So I often talk about adoption, and nobody ever says, "Are you adopted?" Which actually I'm not. I did a talk on compulsive debt and spending and under-earning. Fortunately, nobody else did. But actually, quite a few people have asked me today, did I go to boarding school? And I slightly wanted to play it down. But and it's interesting, there's quite a powerful counter-transference around all this. I also saw my mother this morning, who's a charming, very competent 88-year-old, who said, "Darling, what are you going to talk to them about?" I couldn't tell. So this is the lasting impact. The fear, the protection of the mother, the protection of the parent. As it's just addiction. It's talking about addiction. So the strange counter-transfers. I've also had this sort of feeling that at some point you're going to be really unhappy and start flicking ink at me. So it's just stuff comes up. It's all a bit weird, isn't it? Really, all this sort of stuff comes up. And you know what? I've also been told off already. I've been told off by one of the organisers because actually I'm going to do this without presentation materials. It's going to be a bit of a stand-up, which could go anywhere, I'm afraid. But we'll show a little clip, which I decided to do just to keep everybody happy. So I've already been told off, which is just fascinating. And I thought, my wife said, well, look, maybe you ought to bring some presentation. Bring the tuck box. And put all your presentation materials inside. And everyone you can all nick them, and then I'll try not to cry. So anyway, it's just fraud. The whole thing, it's just full of counter-transfers. It's the whole thing for me. And it's the first time I've done the talk to you, so I really hope it makes sense. I do tend to hold my notes, and I hope it doesn't distract you too much. There's room at the end for complaints and questions and ink flicking. Because there's any flicks ink anymore. Do all of that. But I suppose my fear was, it's very interesting. There's been a lot of psychological literature, as you know, about boarding school. Alex Renson's written a book this year called Stiff Upper Lip. Joy Shabiran wrote a book in 2015, and she coined the phrase boarding school syndrome. Nick Duffel wrote in 2000, I think, his book, The Making of Them. So there's been some sort of stuff around. I'm really interested. I'm a bit of an anorak. I've worked in the addictions field for 30 years. I'm just sort of fascinated in sort of what happens to people in recovery, over time, because we know so much more than we did. When I trained 30 years ago as an addictions counsellor, and then later as a psychotherapist. Addiction was actually about alcohol, and it was starting to be about drugs. In the treatment centre, there was one treatment centre, there were 2 treatment centres 30 years ago, actually. And they were just starting to have, start treating drug addiction. And actually, interestingly, most of the counsellors wore tweed jackets and looked like they were looked like we were at prep school or something. But I'm sort of a bit of an anorak, and I get quite excited, and I hope that's okay. And I'll move around a bit and all that sort of thing. But so here we have it. But the thing is about this is I suppose I was thinking, I don't know if I want them to know I went to boarding school, because I'm not really doing it for that reason. I'm doing it because I think it's just interesting, and I think it's interesting to try and link, because the truth is that people who went to boarding school, particularly early boarders, which is what I'm going to be focusing on, are overrepresented in treatment and recovery programs. Now there might be, it's quite hard to correlate because there could be reasons in terms of being able to pay, for example, but I don't think it's quite that simple. And we know, in the same way we know that adoptees are overrepresented, people with early psychological wounds are overrepresented. I mean, actually, at the moment, just less than 1% of the school population go to boarding school. I don't know what the percentage, we'd have to do some sort of more research really with the treatment centres. But my concern was that somebody said, look, why are we showing compassion for the privileged? Shouldn't we really be focusing on something else? But actually, I hope, what you might sort of see by the end of the talk, and you probably know already, that actually, being privileged doesn't, that doesn't exclude you from addiction and distress. And actually, I think what's terribly interesting is that, if a young child goes into care, we think of it as a tragedy. If a young child is sent to boarding school, somehow it's a privilege. And I think, there's some stuff, I just think some stuff for us to think about. Now, the truth is that boarding, if you go to boarding school today, you probably have a very different experience to the people that might be presenting in treatment now. So the sort of people, if we are treating people with alcohol addictions, they were probably at boarding school in the 90s. I will show a clip actually of some people that were there in the 90s. If people are presenting now with alcohol dependency, they would probably, if they went to boarding school, they're more likely to have been there in the 60s. We don't really know, we're just sort of learning about the process addictions and who's showing up, who's showing up when. So, things, there is no doubt that things have changed. We know that actually going to boarding school at different points, in the childhood life cycle is very different. Going at 8 is going to be very different to going at 12 or 13. We know that the impact is slightly different on girls and boys, and I'll talk a little bit about that. But in general, we have a society that's made it a bit more okay for girls to talk about how they feel. But interestingly, one of the things that had struck me when I was putting the talk together was that actually, if you were a boy going to boarding school historically, you would be called by your surname. If you were a girl, you'd be called by your first name. And I think I just think that's interesting, and I'm not completely sure what that's about. I have a terrible feeling it has something to do with male-dominated society and the fact that a girl's name might only be temporary. I think that might be part of it. But it might also be part of the fact that actually the girls weren't needed as little soldiers for the empire. And there's something about those surnames. I thought we were doing a roll call, actually. Quite good. Because I don't want you, because I think, I'm not going to have a presentation material. There'll be something up on here. I don't want it to look like a lesson. You need to think of this as more like sort of assembly. It's going to be like an assembly. So boarding school has changed a great deal. It's different for boys and girls. But what happened? Joy Shiveran wrote this book in 2015 called Boarding School Syndrome, and it had a subtitle, The Trauma of the Privileged Child. In 2011, she wrote an article in the British Journal of Psychotherapy, and she coined the term Boarding School Syndrome. And I think it was she'd also worked with Nick Duffel, who'd written The Making of Them, and I did quite a lot of conversations with other therapists who were starting to notice, and I don't know, you'll know in therapy, if you're interested in a subject, it certainly presents, doesn't it, in front of you. I think it's a bit the same if you buy a car, you start seeing all the other ones, people who've got the same sort of cars. And just realising that maybe there is a cluster of symptoms that describe some of the difficulties that people who are presenting in therapy rooms have, who've been to boarding school. And I became very interested in taking that a bit further, because when I read these books, actually as an addictions professional and as a bit of an addiction sort of anorak, I was reading about addiction an awful lot, and actually these guys were thinking more about sort of psychotherapy, so I wanted to try and do something that would try and link some of this sort of stuff up. What I'm not going to be doing is attacking boarding school or indeed private education, because that's not really what it's about, but I think I will be raising some concerns about the very British practice of sending early boarders, certainly children around age 7 or 8 to boarding school, because I think that that has an enormous impact on child development. And I think it's really going to be fair for us to start calling it, with a capital T, talking about it as a trauma. And it certainly starts to meet some of the things that we start seeing in these people, that adults meet the criteria for developmental trauma disorder, DTD, as Van der Kolk is calling it, which they've been trying for ages to get into the DSM and just failed, which is a real tragedy. But my hypothesis is that basically for the young child, the moment of leaving home for boarding school is traumatic. Because actually the knowledge that quite large sums of money have been spent on your education, the information that actually this might be the best years of your life, the feeling that you might be privileged, doesn't necessarily fit with that young child's experience. And I think that that is the beginning of some quite powerful shame and anxiety. A feeling of shame that, well, I'm not really good enough, because actually I'm not grateful and I'm rather unhappy. And some real anxiety that, gosh, actually if mum and dad can give me away, I certainly can't really tell them that I'm unhappy. How safe is my world going to be? So that feeling of anxiety that we know underpins addiction so much, that the world is not a safe place, is really coming. So we're talking about an adaptation, a trauma and adaptation, I think at really quite an early age. Because we're talking about a new world, we're talking about suddenly going from the secure base to a new world without parents, without siblings, without pets, without toys. Very often, you might get as many as you can fit in your tuck box. The more I think about it, it's a bit strange. And it's a very, no other nation outsources their education in this way. Relies on the private sector to send. Jeremy Hardy, the comedian, he talks about sort of the English middle classes who put their children in kennels. I think that's quite a good way of thinking about it. We're going to put you in kennels. And even the idea, actually, some of the words that are around about boarding schools, like exeat. So that word exeat, which, by definition means a sort of permission to leave. You sort of think, I think that might be the wrong way around. Maybe you should have permission to go to school, not permission to go home. There's an it's very, very interesting. And there's a Chinese proverb that talks about, if you want to get somewhere, you need to call something, to name something as it is. And I think there's lots of things about early developmental traumas that just aren't actually named properly. So adoption is a classic thing, that we talk about adoptees. It somehow covers up the fact that these are relinquishees. These are people that in many cases have been given up. And people boarding, not quite sure what we would call them, but somehow I think it's quite easy to sort of miss what really goes on. So I'm not going to pathologise everybody who's been to boarding school. I think that won't be very helpful. There are plenty of people who seem to have adapted and had quite good experiences. But we do know that there are lots of people that actually haven't necessarily, and I'm concerned about those, because the purpose of this talk is to think about how can we effectively treatment plan. Because that's what it's about. As addiction professionals, we're seeing people aren't coming into treatment because they're into boarding school, but actually we know more and more. We need to start asking more and more questions about people's stories. It used to be when I trained in the 80s, we were taking alcohol and drug histories, and it was all about that. And then you start seeing people coming back a second time and a third time, and you start to feel uncomfortable about saying, it's just because they were in denial, or, they just haven't got it yet. And starting to think in the development, of our field, where we've started to think about process addictions, and say, what else might be going on for these people? And the exciting thing is our field has also developed, so we start thinking about trauma as well. So what else might be going on alongside? What might these people go through that might be common to this group's experience that actually might also impact on the development of their addiction, but also perhaps impact on the resistance to treatment? Because, you know, the beginning of recovery really is about naming something. If you can't, nothing can change unless you can name it. You know, and I think we've been treating, certainly in the 80s, I think we were treating an awful lot of people that weren't getting well and probably doing a bit of a disservice because there was so much stuff we didn't know then about sex and drug addiction, about the financial addictions. Because addiction is a disease that migrates, and we didn't really know that then either. So I'm not going to be pathologizing everybody. I do want to stimulate thought and raise awareness to inform effective treatment planning. That's the real purpose. And a bit of a sort of caveat, which is that research requires empirical evidence. We've got we have a lot of qualitative data about all of this. There's a lot more research to be done if we're really going to be linking these sorts of things. And I'm certainly not saying that boarding school is the only reason that somebody might become certain people might become addicted. But I will be suggesting that there are some real difficulties. So this the talk is being filmed, and it's going to be access to people who don't necessarily know about addiction. So I'm also going to do a bit of addiction 101, and I hope that's not too sort of patronising to talk about addiction, because I think it's going to be important to just talk about what we know about addiction at this point before we start talking about the wound or wounds that are around for boarding school pupils. It's a very interesting time in the history of addiction. Neuropsychology has massively informed sort of what goes on. Historically, when we've thought about addiction, we've thought about alcohol and drugs, we've thought about chemicals that are ingested, taken intravenously, transdermally, inhaled with the purpose of altering mood. We've done a lot of research about addiction. We think about it as something that is genetically proposed and environmentally disposed. We know it's something that begins with a search for pleasure and ends with some sort of escape from reality. We know that it has an enormous impact on functioning, so that people become willful and self-centred and inconsiderate. We know that willpower is about as effective with addiction as it would be with the measles. But mostly, I think we know that addictions interact, and we know that addiction migrates. And I think for me, as an addiction psychotherapist now, seeing people who've been abstinent from mood-altering chemicals for long periods of time, who are in terrible financial problems with compulsivity, serious problems around sex and love relationships, big difficulties with some of the eating disorders, which are very enduring anyway. But I think what's also interesting is that we've been seeing people who at first were coming with drug and alcohol addiction, who seem to be more addicted to behaviours. People who, these are the people that we're talking about who have these process addictions. So we're talking about people that involve behaviour that interacts with physiology to change mood. So that actually there's a whole now sort of field of addiction where people are becoming their own dealers. The adrenaline from gambling is starting to produce your own drugs. And I think this is really interesting, and we start to see again the interaction. So we know there are big correlations between sex addiction and stimulant, particularly cocaine addiction. We know there's some big correlations between some of the eating disorders and stimulant addiction too. These different things that interact. And I think it's I think it's fascinating really what's happening. So we've got, we think about, the eating disorders have been around for a long time, because if you think about ICD or DSM in terms of classifying diseases, alcohol and substance dependence have been there for quite a long time now. Interestingly, of the financial disorders, only compulsive gambling, I don't know how compulsive gambling got in there so quickly, but it really did. Way before some of the other impulse disorders, and the eating disorders have been there. But we know, don't we? So the eating disorders, we know about anorexia, we know about compulsive overeating, we know about orthorexia, which is this, the unhealthy obsession with healthy eating. The glamorizing of disordered eating, which is something that society is really sort of backing quite big time at the moment. We know much more about the sex and love addictions and the interactions with those. We know about the financial addictions, so the compulsive spending and the compulsive under-earning, which leads to compulsive debt. I'm fascinated by compulsive under-earning, and if any of you are, I've done a TED talk which is online about it, because I think it's actually something that's really there for a lot of people in recovery. It's that ability. It's when you hear people talking about sabotage, I always have a good idea and I sabotage it. For a lot of people, actually this has some sort of addictive quality. People who are really, maybe have the opportunity, have the talent, have the wherewithal to really make something happen, but somehow don't. Have this conflicting sort of feeling of I really want this to happen and I can't. And it really gets kind of addictive. And we also think about codependency. And I think codependency is something that's been massively misunderstood. I remember Rockwell Lerner saying years ago, if you open the door for someone in Minnesota, you would call it codependent. It's just taken us a long time to work out what it's all about. And actually, I think over here, I think we're getting, I think in a way, I think there's a sort of rather British codependence. And I want to suggest to you that codependency is all about the management of anxiety. It's actually, codependency is when behaviour, functioning is governed by the real anticipated or perceived behaviour of somebody else. So it's about regulating anxiety. So as codependence, and the thinking is that actually nearly everybody who suffers from some sort of addictive disorder has some codependence at its root. Because actually, because it's, they do. But it's about the management of anxiety, and we think about so codependence might be managing anxiety by putting someone else at ease, and that's a very classic form of codependence. So actually, you might agree with somebody, you might agree with the way someone votes, even though you don't, because you just want to sort of take it easy. Somebody. At the extreme, people come into the consulting room and they start asking me how my week's been, and after a while you have to remind them that they're paying another therapist. So the management of anxiety by putting people at ease. We also know there's another form of codependency that people don't like talking about because it's not quite so kind, which is the management of anxiety by putting people at dis-ease. And again, I think this is going to link into what we're going to say about the schools and stuff and bullying. So I will feel better about myself by making you feel worse. And we know, particularly in addictive couple relationships, those two sides of codependence go well. So you'll tend to find that one partner will be saying, I just can't get it right for him or her. And the other will be saying, you just can't get it right for me. And so one is forever trying to manage their anxiety by making something better, which doesn't work. And the other is forever trying to manage anxiety by making sure the other person knows that they're the problem. There's the other form of codependence, which is also about alignment, which is where actually we seek to manage anxiety by aligning ourselves to other people and making them think that somehow we're all part of the thing. So I know that's not a lot of sort of boarding stuff, but I want you to hold all that in mind, because actually, some of these addictions, workaholism is another one too, which workaholism is about, it's about compulsive busyness. It's not about working. In fact, it's very often definitely not about working. It's about keeping busy, having projects, managing anxiety by feeling that if I can just get this done, everything will be okay. And then the project ends and somehow it's not okay. And you need to start another project. They say, and some of these addictions, society sort of like the compulsive shopping, part of spending, society sort of smiles on that. As Brené Brown talks about workaholism, people, it can be seen as a badge of honour. But as they say, some people are so poor, all they've got is money. They can work so hard. So I want us to think about all these present addictions. Okay, let's go into boarding. You paying attention? Yes. I have got my detention book. Boarding schools have been around for boys since the 7th century. In the 1600s there were some boarding schools, astonishingly. Some of the famous sort of public schools, Winchester was set up in the 14th century. Eton was set up in the 15th century, apparently by Henry VI, in order to have boys to be choristers, to sing mass. Originally, boys lived in sort of lodgings, and it was only in the 18th century that they moved into dormitories. And when you start researching, you've got to have some of the history of some of the schools. You know, there were stories of dormitories with about 50 to 60 boys. Apparently at Eton, I don't know if nobody might want to learn up, but apparently, I think it was called the Long Room. It was a very long dormitory that had I think it had 52 boys in it, and there's some terrible stories of sort of windows that were broken. They only installed fires there, you know, towards the end of the 19th century. Talking about rats, which is why actually in the 18th century there were 3 parliamentary commissions looking into actually boarding schools, because actually there had been riots, suicides. This is fascinating. So there's a story I was reading about a fight at Eton in 1825. 2 boys fought for about 2 hours, fueled by alcohol, encouraged by teachers, and one of them died. There's another story about one boy being stabbed by someone else with a penknife and dying. So, you know, the Parliament was starting to get a bit concerned about what was going on. Because the thing about all these dormitories too is that you would get put in there at 8 o'clock and, the doors would be locked, there would be no adult supervision, and you were woken up for breakfast. Or probably woken up by your fag for breakfast. Because, actually fagging, if you know about fagging, which is the practice really of having junior boys looking after senior boys as essentially sort of college servants, that was only abolished, finally went out in the 90s as the corporal punishment in the 90s. State schools, actually, it was in the 80s that stopped corporal punishment, it was in the 90s that it started stopping in the independent sector. And fagging, so we're thinking, and maybe you've read or seen the films about Tom Brown's school days and this sort of stuff. Clearly there's quite a lot of evidence that this is the sort of stuff that was this is the sort of stuff that was going on. And we think about, for those that don't know, aren't so familiar with this very strange sort of British culture that we have. These 2 tiers of schools where we have what we call prep schools, sending children perhaps to prep school age 7 or 8, not necessarily to board, and less are boarding now. But again, the people that are coming to our consulting rooms, there were far more when they were at school, because they're coming in age sort of 30-ish. And we're talking about this strange word public school, which of course is very not public, from about the age of sort of 11 or 12 to 18. Girls' boarding is quite hard, it's a bit harder to research, but it seems that girls started boarding maybe at the end of the 18th century, but probably only a few. But some of the big famous girls' schools were certainly set up in the mid sort of 1800s. So, can someone give me a time check?
It's just
Okay. I often say this, I don't know if you know, but actually if you're under stress, the part of the brain that mediates time closes down. So that actually I can tend to think I've been talking for 5 minutes, and you're thinking I've run over and it's been like a couple of hours or something. And there's no clock in this room. So anyway, we're on course. So just talk about the psychotherapeutic sort of interest in boarding schools. And it started in the 80s. There was the sort of what was called the men's movement, and the beginning of men, primarily then middle class men, starting to talk about their feelings together and doing things and sitting in groups and doing stuff that men didn't really do particularly before that, and certainly not many did it then. But I think out of that came Nick Duffel, who wrote this book, The Making of Them. But in 1990, he trained as a psychotherapist, he's very open about this, having had some therapy, and feeling that actually he was quite damaged by his boarding school experience, he decided to offer some workshops called, rather provocatively, Boarding School Survivors. And actually, at the beginning, they were really fully, they were taken up. And in fact, he now operates something called Boarding School Survivors, and you can get specialist therapy and do courses and things, and they're training therapists to work particularly with this group. Although my feeling is in the addictions field, actually, we come across so many people, I think our job is to hold addiction and be informed about these issues. In 1992, the Department of Education published a report from 1991 where Esther Ranson, you remember Esther Ranson from Childline? They did a boarding school line for 6 months in 1991, and they published the reports of that. I'm like, which is great. I think good. I think she made an enormous contribution. It was used by 11% of boarding school children. 11%. Now this is the Department of Education, publishing these figures. 15% reported sexual abuse. Okay, so this is 1991. 20% reported bullying, and over 20% of the whole cohort reported being interrupted while making the phone call. Now, actually, when you think, I was thinking about these figures, and then I thought, wait a minute, these kids didn't have mobile phones. This was the days when if you had a telephone, there weren't that many phones in boarding schools, and if there were there, they were probably in a line, a bit like the basins and the baths, and actually the chance of being private was quite slim, and you could imagine them being reported being interrupted. You could imagine being jostled and shoved off the phone or something, But I think that's quite interesting. 1994, the BBC 40 Minutes, the documentary programme, they made a film called The Making of Them, which Nick Duffel actually took. He consulted on that and took that title as the title of this book. I don't know if anyone's seen it. It's on YouTube. I've edited a few clips together, just about 10 minutes to just see and put you in the mood, believe me. Take you back, some of you back there, possibly. But that was very interesting. In 2000, Nick Duffel published his book. A charity called Boarding Concern started in 2002, really with the aim of highlighting their concerns for the psychological well-being of early boarders. And I think this is the big thing. It's the early boarders that I really wanted to be focused on. Josh Shavron's book coming out in 2015, and then Alex Renton, the journalist, have just published his book Stiff Upper Lip, which is quite a lot of exposure. I don't know if you've seen it. It's took place in the papers. All of these people report getting hundreds of letters in response to the articles and the things that they write. Or, just hundreds of letters. So take a deep breath. I'm going to just play some edited clips, and this is from the 1993, I think it was filmed. So interestingly, the sort of children that you're going to see here are children that would probably be about now, if they had drug problems, be presented for treatment. Okay? If they had alcohol problems, they would be waiting a little bit longer for them. So just let's see that. See it work.
We're frankly grown up. I mean, last year, George said there's George said, I mean, to me, so I think all of us might have been shooting. It's too big, and now it's too good.
Alright, okay darling, and down here, that's alright. Okay.
New boy.
You seem heavily burdened. And how's Alexander? Good, you're looking forward to it. You are really, aren't you? Super.
Let's tea at the George.
Oh, lovely. Can I take any of that? It's probably not heavy, it's just bulky. Is any of this very heavy? That is heavy. Gosh, that's good. What money? Bricks.
So we carry that for you.
So the whole tribe has come.
Yes, they've all come to say goodbye.
Splendid.
Lovely time. Thank you. Right?
Are we going to be head of rugby or not? Just say,
Hi darling.
George will look after you. He might even be in head of rugby.
I've always thought that a good prep school teaches boys how to integrate with their fellows, and when boys come here age 7 or 8, they've never had the experience of living together in a small community. And it's an exciting time to see how they develop and how they relate to each other within that community.
You're right. There's some responsibility for re-traumatising. I think it's quite powerful, isn't it? This little chap, he's about this high and he's just waiting to grow into his jacket, and there's a few more clips, but I'm going to do a bit of slow release, I think. But the Chinese proverb is that the beginning of wisdom is to call things by their proper name. And I think early rupture from home, has this lasting influence on brain development and attachment patterns. That's the point that I want to make. And I'm going to suggest to you that I think that there are 2 traumas attached to early boarding. I think, and you might find these words are a bit extreme. I wonder, but somehow the more I think about it, they feel right. The first actually is the trauma of abandonment. That makes a little bit more sense. The second trauma is one of captivity. And that's the word that actually I think is quite strong and worth us having a think about. About captivity, and I'll say some more about that. So we know about abandonment. If you're left by your caregivers, crying doesn't bring back the people who've left you. So these are the people. So if you're going to have a cry, actually the people that previously would have soothed your tears are the ones that actually have left you. Yeah. So I think that has an enormous impact. Young children can think, particularly in the days of Harry Potter, that they know what boarding school is going to be like, but actually you don't know until you go. You do not know until you go. And in therapy, first days at school are remembered in great detail. It's one of those things that people can really, really describe to you. Which in a way is also quite good, because if you're doing some of the limbic therapies like EMDR, you've really got something, you've got quite powerful memory. But it fascinates me that, there are things, you're going back, remembering things in detail, the further back you go, it can be quite hard, but it's great detail for this. Because, in a sense, mother is lost at an early age. And it's mothers, sadly, that get it in the neck, because of where people are in terms of attachment patterns. It's mothers are the ones who are seen as the caregivers, and they tend to be seen as the ones who've actually been the abandoners, which actually is particularly unfair, because very often, this is male-dominated society, and this is what's going to happen, and little Johnny or little Georgine is going to go off to school, and this is what we're going to do. And I think it has. So when we think about boarding school syndrome, I also want to suggest to you it's not just about the person that goes. I think it has an enormous impact on parents, particularly mothers. I think it has an impact on other siblings. Historically, very often, girls have stayed at home, but boys have gone off to boarding school. What sort of messages happening there? I think birth order has a big an impact. If you're the first to go, there's no preparation. And number 2, very often we talk to people who are the second to go, and they just suddenly, they have this different experience. Number 1, didn't know what a shock it was going to be. Number 2, actually knew, because they actually tended to drop off number 1 and would see the tears, both on leaving and in the car on the way back. So it has an enormous impact. It has an enormous impact on other people. So in a way, I think homesickness is quite an inadequate term. Do I think homelessness might be quite good. I have one of my boys is at Bristol University, and he said to me, he has a state education, and he said to me, Dad, this is an anecdote, so but it fascinated me. He said, Dad, it's really interesting. The people that went to boarding school, the first thing they say to you when they meet you is, where did you go to school? Mm-hmm. The ones who didn't, you say, where are you from? Mm-hmm. Because actually that's the where are you from. Homesickness, because we're talking about grief and mourning a loss. We're talking about suddenly there are no hugs and no kisses goodnight. We're talking about that no special connection. First thing, in the morning or last thing at night. There was an article in The Guardian in the 1990s by a chap who was suggesting that actually early boarding contravened 11 of the articles from the UN on the rights of children that we'd signed up to as a country in 1991. You know, it's an interesting thing that is sort of, that has been happening. And then arriving, we're talking again, and again things are different. You know, they're different if you go to school today, but you know, we're talking about arriving, sleeping, co-sleeping in a dormitory with people that you don't know. Some of the people that were at boarding schools in the sort of certainly 60s, 70s, 80s. Some of those actually there wouldn't be access to a toilet in the night. There might be a pot under the bed. You know, there's suddenly bedtime is just not a safe time. You might have your teddy. But you know, there's a big lack of physical contact. So we're talking about, I think, a trauma of abandonment, but we're also talking about a trauma of captivity. You know, because you can't actually leave without permission. Yeah? You know, and only at certain times of the year. There are privacy issues. Very few. A lot of people talk about there being nowhere really private. You're deprived of many of your own things, perhaps what you can fit into a tuck box. Communication. Now, there's some access to some phones, but we're talking again, the sort of people that we're seeing here, actually they couldn't communicate. I've listened to many people who wrote letters home that were checked by teachers. So there is just a series of letters that say, you know, we beat such and such, 6-0, you know, so-and-so scored a try, or, you know, none of that, you know, because what you can't write is, please can you come and get me? I want to come home. You know, so we're talking again about the beginning of closing down of emotions and the expression of emotions. You know, and bed is not always safe. You know, and that's before, and I'll talk some more about sexual abuse. Can you handle another quick clip? Okay.
But at the same time, I'm thrilled for him.
It's in the front door.
It's a lovely house, isn't it?
Lovely house.
He's waiting for you, look.
Was it once
Mansion.
mansion, yeah?
Yeah.
Hello. Thank you. Hurry.
I had a very interesting conversation last night with a Frenchman I sat next to at dinner, and I just couldn't resist getting onto education, because the French have such different feelings about education. They cannot understand how we can possibly do what we do. How we can bear to send our children away when they should be coming home to us every night and talking to us every night. How we must lose touch with them, and how vital it is to see them changing every day. I totally disagree. I think it's the making of them, this, sending them away. And, you know, I can see what happens by seeing him every 3 weeks. It's not a drama, really.
Bye.
Have time. You're excellent.
Yes. It's heavy, isn't it? Toys. And books.
I guess if you're a psychodynamic therapist, you'd be really interested in it's heavy.
Yes.
You okay? So, abandonment and captivity, I think it's really worth holding those things in mind. So we're talking about a trauma at this stage, which also involves bereavement and adaptation. Okay? And also these high levels of shame and anxiety. And that's an important thing, because what we know about addiction is it's fueled by high levels of shame and anxiety. We know that, you know, to have anxiety is a good thing. It's what stops us taking our kit off and dancing on tables. Do you know, it's a good thing. You know? and as does shame. Do you know, shame and anxiety serve a purpose, but for some people they got it at volume 10. Do you know, that's the point, and we know that that's what's around. It's fueling addictions. So you've got the shame, you know, I'm not good enough because I'm unhappy and I'm not supposed to be. I don't feel grateful. You know, I've disappointed my parents. I am a disappointment. You know, and the anxiety is, I better not let anybody know. You know, this is not a safe place. I can't talk about how I feel because I will reveal my weakness. You know, the people that used to protect me, you know, are not doing so. We're also talking about, is that 45 minutes? That is 45 minutes. Okay. But we're also talking what we know. Alex Renton, actually, who wrote this book, Stiff Upper Lip, which I haven't read, but I've been reading lots of reviews of it. He did some work with Andrew Norfolk, I think it is, who's the Times investigative journalist. And they reckon that something like 50% of the boarding schools in the UK have at some point harboured a paedophile. Historically. I think teacher. Yes, I'm sorry. And I suspect there's probably, somehow, for me, I think it might be sort of higher than that, to be honest, with you. And again, we're talking historically, and this stuff is coming out, we're seeing it a lot in the media. But so we're also talking about these traumas, but also people being put into quite dangerous, you know, to some extent people are being put into quite dangerous situations. So, you know, certainly, you know, in terms of sexual abuse, and you hear all sorts of stories. So we know the hand beneath the sheets, the hand down the trousers, you know. But you also hear about oral sex, and you hear about anal sex. Alex Renton had an email from somebody, which is shocking, who said, I learnt an awful lot at my prep school, but I don't think I should have learned how to give a blowjob when I was 11. You know? Now, I'm not suggesting that's the norm, but we're talking about putting people in, you know, historically people have been put in harm's way. Physical and emotional bullying, you know, which I guess that phrase, the making of them, is all about that somehow it'll be, you'll make a man of you. But the trouble is, being bullied in captivity is not the same as being bullied and coming home. You know, it is very different. Relentless has an enormous impact on brain development. Another clip? Are you homesick? No. I want to talk now about the sort of things that we're seeing in the consulting rooms when people have started to talk about all this stuff and the sort of behaviours that I think actually are part of what Joy is talking about when she said political syndrome. And it's this cluster of symptoms. And actually, I think this, because the talk's being filmed, I think you'll have access to it. But actually, because I don't have presentation materials, actually I'm doing it again, and it's being filmed in a couple of weeks' time. And if you give me your email, I'll send you a CD, or if you do want to, I mean, if you've got to take notes or anything like that. What we see is a very high tolerance for secrecy and disassociation amongst this group of people. That is a problem again when it comes to addiction. Because we talk about people, so actually, talk about people having an enormous tolerance for keeping things to themselves. The leading of the double lives of the sex addicts or the financial addicts. You know, this incredible tolerance for to keep going for a very, very long time and to switch off feeling. You know, there's some spectacular stories. Nick Duffel's book has a story about a chap who was operating some sort of Ponzi scheme. You know, it even involved sort of investors taking money off his family and everybody, you know, the ability to say one thing and do another with absolute charm, you know, which is something you had to learn to do that over a long period of time. We see hypervigilance, that sort of living on red alert, you know, and you would be, if something has suddenly happened to you, you know, the catastrophic thinking that we see around addiction, it's not nonsense. If you've had a catastrophe, your brain, this is the reason we're top of the food chain, You know, your brain does what a good brain does. I think you've had one, you might have another. You know, so there's these levels of anxiety, the hypervigilance, what's going to happen, you don't know what's going to happen next. It's very common for adoptees too, actually, that feeling. What's going to happen next? We've had a rupture, a sudden rupture. Certainly problems with relationships, you know, relationship with self, relationship with partners, a relationship, you know, parenting is problematic. See, a lot of people come into well, the majority of people who come into psychotherapy, which isn't addiction-based, tend to come in when their next birthday has a 0 on the end. I don't know if you know that, because we've decimalised time and we get this idea that, oh, I really want my 40s to be different to my 30s. and it's just that just happens to be a fact. But actually, one of the most important things in psychotherapy is to ask why now, because very often people present with something that's been going on for quite a long time, don't they? And, you know, often, you know, you're seeing men who've got children who may be 7 or 8. And there's something about just seeing this vulnerable little boy that is disturbing something. We had a lady who'd just taken her daughter to university and dropped her off and had a complete meltdown. Her daughter had been schooled at home, but there was just something about the act of leaving that put her in touch with the experience that she had of going off to boarding school. We should probably be a bit worried because our government is comprised of these people. We should be a bit concerned about that sort of thing. What we also see is a very high tolerance for mistreatment. So the amount of people who say it was only bullying. Yeah, it was only bullying, it wasn't sexual abuse, it was only bullying. But again, it's bullying in captivity, it's relentless. You know, this isn't a one-off trauma, this is something, you know, over time. You know, because if you're bullied at the beginning of term, chances are you're going to be bullied all the way through. You know, and people have fear, and you talk to survivors who are terrified about who's going to be in my dormitory next term, will it be safe, will it not? I mean, what a way to spend your holidays, in vigilance about who's going to be around. The loss of trust in justice and fairness, you see an awful lot. You see problems with hierarchy, so you see people who actually just aren't really interested, just don't really give a shit about hierarchy, or people who actually are full of hubris and entitlement and feel that actually somehow they are above normal rules, like these expenses. Problems with visibility. So feelings that either I can only really get on if I'm very visible, head of games, that sort of thing, captain of cricket, scholar, or problems with visibility in terms of actually like I just can't be seen, I need to stay under the radar. And this is one of the things that informs the under-earning. So very capable people who are terrified of actually being seen, because in their minds, limbically, being visible is linked to vulnerability. If I'm seen, I'm bullied. If I'm seen, I'm abused. So these people live under the radar with enormous conflict, because actually we can have a lot of talent, but somehow can't quite understand why they keep sabotaging it. We see quite a lot of seasonal and olfactory memory disturbances, by which I mean certain days of the week can trigger things. Okay, seasonal, or times of year. We had a chap on every Monday and Friday they had this sort of thing that involved vinegar and beetroot for lunch, or there was some awful meal. And actually, way into adult life, Mondays and Fridays began with a, oh God, because you had to eat your food. Because there wasn't any understanding that actually some people don't like some things. Or an understanding that actually children often grow into liking certain things. Seasonal disturbances, particularly the olfactory ones, by which olfactory is about the sense of smell, so actually triggered by autumn, the smell of leaves and autumn leaves, actually can trigger all sorts of mood and issues and depression. It's something about we're going back after the summer, we're going back to school, and that smell. Problems with empathy. We also see either indifference to suffering, or we see people actually being perhaps over-empathetic, placing their own map of abandonment. So, if I was abandoned and it felt so awful, if I see something like the lady who took her daughter to university, it really wasn't the same, but actually somehow the feeling is, gosh, I'm doing the same thing. You put your map of abandonment onto someone else. We're seeing problems, so then if we start to think about problems of functioning and the need to self-soothe, because that's the other key thing. I think these key things around addiction are the tolerance for secrecy, really problematic, and also the need to self-soothe, because the belief that actually I need to look after myself. So what we start to see is quite a lot of codependent behaviour, which I'm to suggest to you bullying is also codependent, putting another at dis-ease in order to feel okay oneself, but also a lot of putting people at ease and fitting in and trying and giving sweets and buying friends and that sort of thing. We start to see the beginning of some of the sexual disorders, compulsive masturbation, use of pornography if you can get it, but certainly masturbation. Again, that's going to be that's happening probably not at age 8, but it's going to be happening. But certainly touching yourself without ejaculation is being reported from age 10 or onwards. Compulsive busyness, studying, achieving, again, eating issues, all sorts of issues around food, and then later on in boarding issues around sort of substance misuse and perhaps financial issues. And I think again there is a major problem with substance misuse in the private boarding sector, simply because there's so much time with peer group and away from people that can actually spot, parents who can spot differences in what's going on with Johnny. Why is he different? Because actually the people charged with care, who might be very capable, have an awful lot of children. I mean, it's interesting. You call yourself a house parent. Gosh, you've been having a lot of sex to be a house parent to that many children. And we've also got the issues around physical and developmental stuff. So the whole idea of menstruation and what that's like, and if you're away from home and people reporting not really being told and not really knowing what to do. The issues around puberty, where depending whether you're going to enter puberty earlier or later, have an enormous impact on your study. Could it be on either pride or embarrassment? Are you going to be big and in the rugby team you're going to be small and someone's going to call you a weed? All to do with just the way that actually your puberty comes online. And of course sexual development. An awful lot of confusing being sexual with love. The missing out of skin on skin, for example, and before we start talking about homophobia, calling somebody gay actually till recently is a childhood insult. Can you have another clip?
It has changed me, and the one thing which I can do now is get used. Because when I'm older, I'm gonna and much later, or when I'm older, and I'm somewhere at 20, I'm gonna be, and if I become a businessman, I'm gonna have to be able to manage by myself. And so being at boarding school is I think it's quite a lot about being able to manage and handle yourself without any sort of help from other people. Everybody needs help from other people sometimes in their life. But going to boarding school for me is a real achievement. It's made me more grown up, and it makes you more grown up, and it gives you a better education. And when you might become a prefect in Division 1, and it gives you a responsibility. It really has changed me quite a lot, and I'm able to manage by myself.
How old are you?
I'm 10 on November the 3rd. Because I'm 9 at the moment, and I had a clown birthday cake last time, and it was really nice. But on the nose, it was that really yummy stuff, and it was red, and I had it really, and I had the nose all to myself, and it was really nice. So I ate all of it. So I went, right, that nose is mine, and I had a piece of cake, and I had the nose.
I've only got a couple more clips. So, how are we doing for time? An hour, okay. You all right? Am I making some sense?
Yes.
Yeah? Okay. Really good. Let's just do a little bit, a bit on trauma and a bit on attachment, just to understand why this has such an impact on child development. The thing about the human brain is it starts working before it's built. That's one of the differences. If you buy a computer, you've got an operating system, you turn it on, it works. The human brain starts working before it's built. Van der Kolk will say, experience is the architect of the brain. I wish that was my quote, but I need to acknowledge it versus someone else's. We're born with 100 billion neurons just waiting to get cues from experience to join together to make sense of the world. So actually, if early on, if you're a 7 or an 8-year-old, and actually you're having some of these experiences of abandonment and captivity, and you start to have to adapt, what's happening is those neurons are firing. This is the Alan Shaw quote, Alan Shaw being the American neuropsychologist, whose books are impossible to read but always worth quoting. What he says, his quote is, neurons that fire together wire together. That's what happens. So we know that this stuff, that's why it's so enduring. And we're talking about wiring that also is quite limbic rather than frontal cortex. So which is why when some child says, sticks and stones may break my bones but words will never hurt me, that has no impact on the brain at all. Because the limbic brain actually, it's experiencing stuff, it defies logic. That's a frontal cortex, ditty. It doesn't make, you can't, it's one of the reasons why CBT doesn't work actually around this stuff. You have to do some therapies that have some impact on the limbic brain. Yes, you need to have some cognition, you need to have some understanding of what's happened, but the real change is going to happen. And let's just do attachment. So, you can't do a counselling course without learning about attachment, can you really? And Mr. John Bowlby and his crew. But it was great work. Some of you, if you've done your trainings, do you remember seeing black and white film of children going in being left in hospital?
Yes.
Yeah? They weren't that. Yeah, and that's part of it. But they took these films in the 50s. It's really harrowing. It's actually much worse than watching this. Of these kids, slightly younger than the boarding school children, but being left in hospital. And his work had an enormous impact on actually allowing parents of children to go and be in hospital at the same time. Because these kids were really just being abandoned. And actually when you talk to them in therapy, they have the same olfactory stuff, which is the smells of the cleaning fluids and the linoleum and all of that, which actually people have about school, the smell of the polish, all that sort of stuff. But the thing is, it's so obvious now, but what Bowlby was saying is that there's an inbuilt biological system that motivates humans, and other animals, to seek proximity to their caregivers in order to feel safe, And that's why when they're not around them, that's why puppies make a lot of noise, ducklings make a lot of noise when mummy disappears. So we're talking about a rupture in attachment, because you make a lot of noise because mummy's disappeared, but actually mummy disappeared on purpose. Yeah? And after a while, and people will cry for a long time, and you'll hear these stories of cry. Well, that little boy in the clip, are you homesick? No. Because in the end, the tears actually becomes a whimper. It's an injured mammal. It's an injured mammal. So ruptured attachments and this powerful brain development. It's nearly over.
Well, I really do like it here. It's a really nice place. Really good food, really good grounds, friends. But at home, I guess, when it feels more, you're near your toys, you're near your pets. You've got your mother and you've got your father and your family around you. And then here you've got your, about all you've got from home that you can really, really cuddle or anything is your teddies, but don't need them much.
Now then, a message from your mother. Phoning up from Oxford. Terribly held up. So she'll be here, but it might be in about an hour and a half. At worst. Might be a bit early. Okay.
You get a sense of the cognitive gymnastics that mums have to go through too, don't you? So let's talk about recovery. I think it's a very interesting clinical population because we're talking about people who are quite resistant to recovery because of the shame. It's very similar to if you work with people who've been sexually abused, very typically the female reaction will be somehow, did I do something that brought this on? The male reaction will be just a real shame that somehow allowed it to happen, as if some young boy could stop it happening. So there's so much shame attached to the fact that actually there were overwhelming emotions. And of course the difficulty asking for help, because as that little boy told us, boarding school teaches you to manage on your own. We also see a lot of compliance. So, treatment centres, you may have noticed some of them look like sort of minor prep schools. Bells ring, and people sort of know what to do. I have to behave here, I'm in treatment, you know what to do. They might be head of group. So you see an awful lot of compliance. You also see breaks, now in private practice, breaks in therapy aren't, because if you do a counsellor training, as you know, or psychotherapy training, there's a lot of focus on breaks in therapy. They're just not an issue for people with borders. It's iCAAD. It's iCAAD. And I've heard of people who've been with therapists who are not really getting this stuff and be told, look, surely you must feel angry with me because we can't take myself on holiday. No. Because this is all part of the adaptation. Breaks in therapy, compliance and resistance. Now the aims of, we think about it, the aims of treatment, aren't they, are to not be possessed by the past. That's definitely one of the aims. To find oneself and forgive oneself, and if you're spiritually minded, it would be forget oneself and try and move away from the self-centeredness. At the aims around addiction are to stay stopped, not stopping but stay stopped, and practically the aims of treatment are about the ability to self-care and to regulate peace of mind. So what's needed? I think one of the things that's definitely needed is what Alice Miller had this phrase called the enlightened witness. I think people, if we're going to help these people, actually the first thing they're going to need is information. You can only change what you acknowledge. If somebody doesn't say, hey, this is a thing, you're not really going to think, you're going to keep quite quiet about it. But if someone's going to say, when you're taking a social history, did you go to boarding school, what was that like? If you're an enlightened witness, actually you can give some permission for people to look at stuff. I think groups are very helpful for this population to, again, just learning, because recovery can be measured by the amount of uncomfortable actions that you take. Because as you take uncomfortable actions that invariably are uncomfortable conversations, you're creating new neural pathways. So actually helping these people to talk and have some universality is really helpful. Well-being is also going to be very good for regulating all trauma. We know this, of exercise, nutrition and mindfulness. And then the sort of therapies that also work on limbic wounds, so neurofeedback, EMDR, eye movement desensitization, processing. There's lots of negative cognitions that could be picked out. Somatic experiencing, the neuroaffective relational model, NARM. There's all sorts of interesting things that can be done as a sort of an add-on to the work. There are, if people want specific counselling, there is boarding school survivors, there's boarding concern, that will make recommendations, and there's these books. And actually there has just started something called Boarding Schools Anonymous. But it's having a lot of trouble getting off the ground, simply because actually it's having a struggle to understand what step one, what is it that they're actually powerless over. But I think it might get there, and it's certainly a forum for people in recoveries to come and talk more specifically. about this stuff. We are nearly there, but I'm going to give you another.
It's hard to choose which is best for me, and if anybody ever asked me, what do you think you should do? Do you think you should stay with your mummy, or do you really want to stay with your mummy, or do you really want a good education? I wouldn't be able to answer that question. I wouldn't be able to answer that question. Not really.
Green shirt.
Mummy, how long till I see you again?
3 weeks? 2 weeks? 2.5 weeks?
Can't be 2.5.
Brilliant. I'll look in my diary. Yeah, how's my voice?
So, I'm just suggesting to you, I think there's some problems with early boarding. Yeah? I think there's some problems. It has an enormous impact on brain development and attachment patterns that are enduring. Okay? It involves 2 traumas, the trauma of abandonment and the trauma of captivity. Yeah? Because, as a result of those traumas, there are some factors that actually make people vulnerable both to addiction and resistant to recovery. So there's tolerance for secrecy and the need to self-soothe at an early age, and the resistance being, I've got to manage on my own, I can't talk about it. So I hope that somewhere we can feel a bit of compassion for the so-called privileged who come into our consulting rooms. I'm going to end with a quote from Rupert Everett's book, the actor Rupert Everett, Red Carpets and Other Banana Skins, it's called. And he wrote a whole chapter about, Georgina gave me this quote, he wrote a whole chapter about his prep school, did he, or going to school. So he's talking about his mum. He's at school, he's been dropped off. I think he's got an older brother who's also at school. It was his first day of boarding school, and he's talking about his mum. She stumbled into the car and shut the door. I looked down at the tears splashing on my new shoes, new sandals from Starbright. Last week I'd loved them, but now they were just another part of the plot against me. I couldn't look up. I didn't want to see the betrayal in my mother's eyes. My brother took my hand and nudged me as my mother unwound the window and waved. What are you looking at, darling? She was crying and her mascara had run. My shoes, I said, and I looked up. The car had already moved on. We watched the hillman glide down the long avenue towards the gates, my mother looking back at us and waving, my father's face firmly fixed on the road ahead. Still holding hands, frozen between one world and the next, my brother and I stared at the taillights with a terrible intensity as they disappeared around the corner. Maybe they would wink a sudden reprieve. The whole image would dissolve and we would be back home at the end of a nasty dream. As long as we could see them, we were still in some kind of contact. But with their last glimmer died all hope, and we were left to make our own way through the rest of our lives in the tradition of our empire-ruling forebears. But where was the fucking empire? Because it had gone a long time before. So I think if you want to send your children at primary school age to boarding school, you should apply to social services. Don't you think? Make a case and get permission. Because it's an offence to take a child out to go on a holiday with a parent. But somehow it's okay to send somebody for early boarding.